The morning began the same as every morning on the plantation, with the sound of pain. A whip cracked through the thin veil of dawn, snapping Samuel awake before his body was ready. His eyes opened to the dim light creeping through the cracks of the slave quarters. The air was heavy with the stench of sweat, mold, and hopelessness. His back ached from yesterday's labors, scars tugging against his skin every time he shifted. The marks of the overseer's whip never fully healed. They were carved into him like the master's claim of ownership. Around him, bodies stirred, fellow slaves rising in silence, their faces hollowed by hunger. No one spoke. Words in the morning could cost you precious strength, and besides, words never eased the cruelty that waited outside. Samuel sat up slowly, every bone stiff, his muscles screaming from another night on the hard dirt floor. Another crack rang out, this one closer. Then came the voice of the overseer, "Up. All of you bastards up before I drag you out by your necks." The door burst open. A sliver of sunlight struck Samuel's face, blinding him for a moment. And then the silhouette of the overseer filled the entrance. His shadow stretched across the room, as dark and cold as the iron keys that jingled at his belt. Behind him, 2 Irish famine survivors stumbled forward, their cheeks hollow, their eyes sunk deep in their skulls. They were newcomers, desperate for work, yet already broken. The overseer barked orders, cursing at the Irish and the black alike. Though Samuel noticed the difference in his tone, the Irish were spoken to with disdain, but the slaves were spoken to with hatred. To the overseer, Samuel was not even human. Dragging himself to his feet, Samuel followed the others into the blinding morning. The sky stretched wide above them, a pale blue canvas. Once, he had loved the sky. As a child in Africa, he remembered lying on his back beside his sister, watching the clouds drift like spirits. Back then, the sky had meant freedom. Now it was a cruel reminder, endless space, unreachable. While he remained chained to the soil, the air outside smelled of dust and sickness. The famine had brought waves of hunger across the land, even into the plantations. The master had purchased starving Irish laborers for almost nothing, pitting them against the slaves as if suffering could be measured, compared, weaponized. Samuel saw one boy, pale, red-haired, no older than 14, collapse before even reaching the fields. The overseer cursed, kicked him in the ribs, and dragged him upright. Samuel's stomach clenched with hunger. His last meal had been a handful of spoiled cornmeal 2 nights ago. His tongue felt like leather, dry and heavy in his mouth. Yet there was no pause, no mercy. The field stretched endlessly, rows of barren soil where potatoes once thrived before the blight. Now they were forced to dig, replant, or haul, work without purpose. Work meant only to break bodies and spirits. The lash cracked again, this time across the back of a slave who had faltered. Samuel's fists clenched instinctively, but he forced himself to look down at the soil. Anger was a dangerous fire. If it showed on his face, it could cost him his life. As the day dragged on, Samuel's mind wandered to fragments of his past. He saw his mother's hands strong, calloused from work, yet gentle when they held him. He remembered his sister's laughter, sharp and bright like birdsong. The memories came unbidden, stinging more than the whip, for they reminded him of all he had lost. He had been taken as a boy, chained in the belly of a ship, and delivered into a lifetime of servitude. Every day since had been a lesson in pain. By midday, sweat poured from his body, stinging the open welts on his back. His legs trembled with weakness. He watched one of the Irish women collapse, her thin arms unable to carry another basket of soil. The overseer's face lit with cruelty as he raised his whip. The crack echoed, and her cry split the air. Samuel looked away, his jaw tightening, his breath shallow with rage he could not release. When the sun finally dipped low, Samuel's body felt carved from stone. He moved in a haze, each step heavier than the last. Yet inside, beneath the hunger and pain, something still smoldered. A stubborn flame. They had taken his freedom, his family, his dignity, but not his will to endure, as he was herded back toward the quarters. Chains clinking with every step, Samuel lifted his gaze once more to the endless sky. For a fleeting moment, He imagined himself free, running beneath it, breathing without fear. The vision faded quickly, crushed by the overseer's shove, but it left behind a trace of defiance. The chains bound his body, but his spirit still whispered, "Endure," still whispered, "Endure." The fields stretched wide and endless, a graveyard of withered crops. The soil was dry, cracked in places, still reeking faintly of rot from the blight that had turned potatoes into blackened mush. Samuel walked among the others in silence, a basket strapped to his raw shoulders, the weight pressing into bruises that never healed. Around him, the overseers barked orders, their voices sharp as blades. The sun had not yet reached its peak, but already sweat poured down his back. Hunger gnawed at his belly like an animal. Days had passed since any of them were fed more than scraps, and the scraps were often spoiled or crawling with worms. Still, they ate because hunger left no dignity. Samuel had swallowed moldy corn more than once, praying his body would not reject it. Beside him stumbled a thin Irish boy, no older than 15, his hair the color of copper dulled with dirt. His name was whispered once, Patrick, but Samuel had never spoken to him. The boy's ribs pushed against his skin, his lips cracked with thirst. He fell to his knees, the basket slipping from his hands. The overseer, Collins, strode over, whip already in hand. Samuel's chest tightened. He had seen this moment before, countless times. The punishment was always the same. "On your feet," Rat Collins barked, his face red, veins straining at his temples. Patrick tried to stand, his legs shaking violently. He rose an inch, then collapsed again. The whip cracked through the air, slicing across the boy's back. His scream was high-pitched, thin, not unlike the cry of a dying animal. Samuel flinched but kept his eyes down, forcing himself to dig his shovel into the dry earth. Looking too long at suffering made you part of it? Still, the sound stayed in his ears. Samuel's arms burned as he dug. The work had no purpose. The soil was barren, but the overseers demanded endless turning, lifting, carrying. If a man faltered, if his pace slowed, the lash would remind him of his place. Samuel's hands blistered, the skin split and raw, but the shovel never stopped moving. To stop was to invite death. As the hours crawled by, Samuel's mind drifted back to his mother's voice. He remembered her lullabies, songs of strength, of rivers and skies, of ancestors watching from beyond. He clung to those words now, humming silently to himself as he worked. They gave rhythm to his motions, though each breath still burned. The Irish beside him muttered in their own language. Words Samuel did not understand, but felt. Grief and hunger had a universal sound. Their faces were hollow mirrors of his own suffering. Yet there was a difference. When they fell, sometimes they were beaten, sometimes dragged back to work. When Samuel or any slave fell, the punishment was merciless, often fatal. Near the edge of the field, an older Irish woman collapsed. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders, revealing bones where flesh should have been. She whispered something, maybe a prayer, before her body sagged into the dirt. Collins sneered, striking her with the whip. Not once, but several times. The overseer forced 2 others to haul her upright. "She works, or she starves," he spat. Samuel's throat burned with unspoken rage. He wanted to shout, to curse Collins, to throw his shovel down and rise against him, but the memory of lashes across his own back kept him silent. Rage could not feed him. Rage could not protect the others. Rage only gave Collins more power. By afternoon, Samuel's body felt like a husk. His vision blurred. The world tilted around him. The shovel grew heavier in his hands until it was no longer a tool, but a stone dragging him downward. He closed his eyes for a moment, just one moment, and saw his sister's smile, wide, innocent, untouched by chains. He forced himself upright again. The memory was both a wound and a weapon. When the overseers finally called an end, the slaves staggered back to the quarters. No food awaited them, only water to foul to drink without gagging. Samuel lowered himself onto the dirt floor, his body trembling. He pressed his palm to his stomach, hollow and rumbling, and thought of the Irish boy, Patrick. He wondered if the boy still breathed. The night pressed in, heavy and suffocating. In the dark, Samuel whispered to himself, the same words his mother once sang, "Hold on." Hold on, child. One day, chains will break. But as his eyes closed, he could not decide if the words were comfort or curse. The sun was cruel that morning. A blazing fire in the sky that offered no warmth, only punishment. Heat shimmered across the fields, pressing down on Samuel and the others like a second set of chains. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging. But he dared not lift a hand to wipe it away. The overseer Collins patrolled the rows with his whip coiled loosely in one hand. He walked slowly, savoring the fear his presence carried. Every footstep on the cracked soil felt like a drumbeat of dread. Samuel had learned to keep his gaze down, to move without hesitation, to swallow pain without a sound. But hunger and exhaustion were enemies that no obedience could silence. By mid-morning, Samuel's body gave way. His knees buckled, the shovel slipping from his grasp as he dropped into the dirt. A sharp gasp escaped him before he could stop it. Collins was on him instantly. "You lazy bastard," the overseer snarled, his spit hitting the ground near Samuel's face. "You think you can rest while others work?" Samuel tried to push himself upright, but his arms trembled violently, his chest heaving. He knew what was coming. Fear coiled in his gut like a serpent, but even worse was the shame. Shame at being too weak to endure. Shame at becoming the spectacle. Collins grabbed him by the back of his shirt and dragged him to a wooden post at the edge of the field. The other slaves froze in their work, eyes averted, but Samuel felt their pity like fire on his skin. He was about to be the lesson. The whip uncoiled with a hiss. "Count them," Collins ordered. "If you miss a number, I start again." Samuel's heart pounded. He had counted before, for others, hearing their voices break before the end. Now it was his turn. The first strike landed with a crack that tore through flesh and sent fire racing down his spine. He bit back a cry, but the sound burst from him anyway. 1. He choked. The second strike ripped across the first, his body jerking against the ropes that bound his wrists to the post. 2. Collins smiled. He lived for this. Each lash was delivered with precision, designed not to kill, but to break. Blood ran freely by the fifth stroke, soaking into Samuel's torn shirt. The world narrowed to pain, a red haze filling his vision. 6. His voice cracked. His throat felt raw, his body trembling. The lashes blurred together after that, numbers spilling from his lips, sometimes barely audible. His mind drifted, floating away from the agony. He saw his sister's face again, her laughter echoing. He heard his mother singing softly by the fire. The memories shielded him, though faintly, like thin cloth against a storm. When the final lash came, Samuel's body hung limp against the post. His voice was gone, the last number swallowed in blood and dust. Collins released him, letting him collapse into the dirt like discarded trash. "Let this be a reminder," the overseer sneered, his voice carrying across the field. "Work or suffer." Samuel lay motionless, the earth cool against his cheek. He wanted to sink into it, to let it swallow him whole. But then, hands reached for him, rough, trembling hands of fellow slaves. They lifted him gently, carried him back toward the quarters when Collins wasn't looking, in the dim safety of the barracks. Miriam, the older slave woman, tore a strip of cloth from her skirt and pressed it against his wounds. "Stay still," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the tears in her eyes. "They want you broken. Don't let them." Samuel groaned, his breath ragged. He wanted to speak, to thank her, but the words tangled in his throat. That night, as the others slept in silence, Samuel lay awake staring at the rafters. His body burned with pain, but beneath the agony, something stirred. Collins had lashed his back raw, but he had not silenced his spirit. The whip had drawn blood, but also defiance. Asterisk. Asterisk. That night, Samuel's sleep was no refuge. Dreams pulled him back across the ocean. To the place where his chains began, he was a boy again, standing on warm earth beneath a wide African sky. He smelled smoke from his mother's cooking fire, heard his sister's laughter as she chased goats near the hut. For a moment, the memory felt alive, as if he could step into it and stay forever. But then came the thunder of boots, shouts in a foreign tongue. Men stormed the village with torches and muskets, their faces twisted with greed. Samuel remembered running, the ground sharp under his bare feet, but strong hands seized him, dragged him into the dark. His mother's scream cut through the night, a sound that had lived in his bones ever. Since, the dream shifted to the ship's belly, damp and foul, packed with bodies chained together. Samuel remembered the stench of sickness, the cries of children, the endless black waves outside. He remembered how silence grew heavier each day, as voices faded one by one. He jerked awake, his body slick with sweat, the wounds on his back throbbing like open mouths. For a moment he couldn't breathe, trapped between memory and reality. The barracks were quiet except for the sound of shallow breathing. Dozens of chests, rising and falling in exhausted rhythm. Morning came with fire. Samuel woke to shouts outside, overseers screaming accusations. Dogs barking furiously. The slaves were driven into the yard, blinking in confusion. Smoke curled above the storage shed, flames licking at the sky. The master stood near the fire, his fine coat spotless, his face twisted in rage. "One of you filthy creatures thought you could steal from me," he spat. His voice was calm, too calm, and that made it worse. Collins dragged a man forward. Jonah, a broad-shouldered slave whose only crime had been hunger. His face was bruised, blood dripping from his lip. His hands bound. "I'll teach you what happens to thieves," the master said, before anyone could speak. Collins struck Jonah across the face, then forced him to his knees in the dirt. The flames roared higher, casting everything in orange light. The slaves stood frozen, fear closing their throats. Samuel clenched his fists. He knew Jonah, a quiet man who once hummed while he worked, a man who shared scraps of food when he had them. Now he knelt like a sacrifice, his eyes hollow but proud. Collins beat him until he collapsed, then dragged him toward the smoking ruin of the shed. Jonah's body was dumped on the ground, barely moving. The overseers laughed as if it were a game. Samuel's stomach turned. The smoke filled his lungs, choking him. But what suffocated him more was helplessness. Every whip crack, every scream, every death pressed heavier on his chest, around him. The Irish workers whispered in broken voices, telling stories of their own families across the sea, mothers and fathers starving, children buried in shallow graves. Their misery was different but familiar, a mirror of Samuel's own. Hunger was a chain too, invisible but binding. Samuel stared at the fire, the flames dancing in his eyes. Something inside him shifted. The blaze reminded him of his burning village, of the torches that had stolen his life. But it also lit a spark inside him. Rage that was no longer silent, grief that was no longer numb. That night, back in the quarters, Samuel could not sleep. His back ached, his stomach growled, but his mind was alive with fire. He thought of Jonah's battered body, of his mother's scream, of Colin's grin as the whip sang. He whispered into the dark, barely a breath. One day, this will end. Miriam, awake beside him, heard. She laid a hand gently on his arm. "Hold on, Samuel," she said softly. "Ashes don't stay ashes. Something always grows from them." Her words lingered, fragile yet powerful. For the first time in years, Samuel allowed himself to imagine it. Not just survival, but something more. The fire outside had died down, but inside Samuel, the flames had only begun to rise. The morning began, as all others did, with the lash of words, the weight of hunger, the endless march to the fields. Samuel's body still burned from his wounds, each step tugging at the torn flesh across his back. The sun rose quickly, and already the air shimmered with heat. The work was the same, digging, hauling, carrying, until muscle turned to fire and breath came ragged. Hunger hollowed him, leaving his hands unsteady on the handle of his shovel. The Irish survivors labored nearby, their bodies no stronger than the slaves. Many of them were gaunt, their cheeks sunken, their eyes like empty wells. Samuel noticed a girl among them. She could not have been more than 13 or 14, her hair tangled, her dress ragged from weeks of labor. Her name, he would later learn, was Nora. She carried herself differently than the others, her gaze not yet fully crushed. She looked at people, not through them. That evening, when the overseers herded them back to the quarters, Samuel dropped onto the dirt floor, his chest aching with every breath. The slaves settled in silence, conserving what little strength they had. Then he heard a rustle, a whisper of movement. A shadow lingered near the entrance. It was the girl. She glanced over her shoulder nervously before slipping inside. In her hand was a scrap of bread, no bigger than her palm. She hesitated, eyes darting between the slaves and the open door, then walked straight toward Samuel. Her hands trembled as she extended the bread to him. Samuel stared, stunned. Food was life. No one gave it away freely. His stomach twisted painfully at the sight of it, but he looked at her face first. Her eyes, wide and uncertain, held no cruelty, no superiority, only compassion. He took the bread slowly, his fingers brushing hers. For a heartbeat, their gazes locked. No words passed between them, but the silence spoke louder than speech. Samuel felt something he had not felt in years: recognition. She saw him not as a beast, not as property, but as a man. "Go," Miriam whispered urgently, tugging at Samuel's arm. "Before they catch her." Nora nodded quickly and slipped away, vanishing into the night. Samuel held the bread in his hands like a sacred thing. It was coarse, stale, barely enough to ease the ache in his belly. But when he ate it, the taste filled him with more than food. It was a reminder that kindness had not been extinguished from the world. That night, whispers moved through the quarters. Miriam spoke of her son, sold away years ago, her voice breaking with grief. Another slave murmured a prayer for Jonah, whose body still lay buried in the soil he once tilled. Samuel chewed the last crumbs slowly, listening. His heart heavy yet strangely alive. The fragile moment of peace did not last. The next day, Collins caught another slave, hiding food. It was nothing more than a rotten apple, tucked beneath the man's shirt. But it was enough. Collins dragged him into the yard, forcing everyone to watch. "You want to steal?" Collins bellowed, his eyes blazing. "Then watch what theft costs." The man's cries echoed as the whip tore into him, each strike more savage than the last. Blood pooled on the ground. No one dared to move. Samuel clenched his fists so tightly his nails dug into his palms. He remembered Nora's gift, the bread she had risked punishment to give. He knew if Collins had seen it, she would have suffered the same fate. The overseer left the man broken in the dirt, a warning carved into flesh. The slaves returned to their work in silence, but Samuel's mind would not quiet. The bread, the girl's eyes, Miriam's touch, they were dangerous, yes, but they were also powerful. They reminded him that cruelty did not own every corner of the world. As night fell again, Samuel lay awake, staring into the darkness. His body trembled from exhaustion, but inside, something steadier had taken root. Kindness, he realized, was a form of resistance. It could not stop the whip, nor fill the stomach, but it kept the soul alive. And as long as the soul endured, so too did hope. Endured, so too did hope. The days bled together in heat and hunger, but the tension on the plantation grew heavier with each sunrise. The famine worsened. Food grew scarcer, and the master's temper snapped more easily. Whispers of disobedience spread among the slaves like sparks in dry grass, not open defiance, but muttered words, clenched fists, the fire of anger hiding in their eyes. Samuel felt it too. Every lash, every insult, every burial fed the storm inside him. It broke one afternoon. The sun hung merciless above the fields when Jonah, broad-shouldered, scarred and tired of cruelty, dropped his basket with a thud. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, his hands balled into fists. Collins, never far from his prey, noticed instantly. "Pick it up," Collins ordered, his whip already twitching in his hand. Jonah didn't move. His silence was louder than any shout. Collins stepped closer. "I said pick it up, nigger," his voice dripped with venom. Jonah finally turned, his face carved with fury. For a moment, Samuel saw the man not as a beaten slave, but as a warrior. "No," Jonah said. His voice was low, steady, and final. The overseer's face twisted into a smile, the kind that promised pain. The whip cracked, slashing across Jonah's chest. Jonah staggered, but did not fall. He lunged instead, grabbing the whip midair, yanking it from Colin's hand. Gasps rippled through the field. It was madness. It was suicide. But for that heartbeat, Jonah was free. He swung the whip once, striking Collins across the face. Blood sprayed from the overseer's cheek. The other slaves froze, their bodies trembling between terror and awe. Samuel's chest surged with hope and dread at once. Collins screamed for the guards. Guns glinted in the sun as two men rushed forward. Jonah fought like a cornered lion, fists striking, teeth bared. But against rifles and whips, his strength was not enough. The gunshot tore through the air, silencing everything. Jonah staggered, blood blooming across his chest. His body dropped into the dirt, the soil drinking it greedily. Samuel's heart wrenched. His throat burned with a scream he could not release. The world tilted around him, the sun, the fields, the smell of blood mingling with earth. Jonah's body lay still, his eyes staring at the sky he would never reach. "Dig," Collins ordered coldly, pressing a rag to his wounded cheek. His voice was calm again, almost casual. "Put him in the ground." The slaves obeyed, because disobedience meant death. Shovels bit into the soil, each strike a betrayal, each clump of earth a weight on Samuel's chest. His hands trembled as he worked, the blisters reopening, blood mixing with sweat and dirt. When the hole was ready, Jonah's body was lowered in. No prayers were spoken aloud, but the silence of dozens of bowed heads carried its own holiness. Tears streaked Miriam's face. Patrick, the Irish boy, turned away, unable to watch. Samuel forced himself to look. He owed Jonah that much. The soil fell over him in dull thuds, covering his face, his chest, his arms, until nothing remained but a mound of dirt. Just another scar on the land. That night, Samuel sat in the quarters, his body shaking, his stomach too knotted to eat even the scraps offered. The faces around him were pale, eyes hollow. No one spoke Jonah's name, but his absence screamed louder than words. Samuel pressed his palms into the earth beneath him, feeling the rough dirt against his skin. The same soil that grew crops now swallowed their dead. It drank their sweat, their tears, their blood. It bound them as much as the chains. He whispered into the dark, barely moving his lips. "How much more can we give this ground before it chokes on us all?" Miriam's voice answered softly, though she did not look at him. "The soil remembers, Samuel. One day it will speak back." But Samuel wasn't sure. All he felt was a hollow void, as though Jonah's grave had been dug in his chest. For the first time, survival itself felt like betrayal. Asterisk, the days after Jonah's death were soaked in silence. Every field row, every cabin corner, every meal was shadowed by the memory of his blood soaking into the soil. The overseers cracked their whips louder now, their eyes sweeping the rows for the faintest flicker of rebellion. Collins, his scar still raw across his cheek, watched Samuel more than anyone. He knew strength when he saw it, and Samuel's silence was dangerous. But even silence has a way of breaking. One night, after the children were asleep and the guard's footsteps had faded, Miriam leaned closer to Samuel. Her voice was barely above breath. "We can't keep dying like this," she whispered. "Not one by one." Samuel glanced toward the door. "Keep your voice down," he warned. Fear was etched into his bones too deeply to shake. "They'll hear," but Miriam's eyes burned. "Then let them." Jonah died standing. Better that than living bent. The words lodged in Samuel's chest, sharp and heavy. He thought of Jonah's last defiance, the way his body fell, but his spirit had soared, only for a heartbeat. Later that week, Patrick slipped Samuel a scrap of paper. The boy's hands shook, but his eyes were wide with urgency. "There's talk," he muttered. "Some of the Irish want to run. They've been mapping the woods." Watching the guards' rotations, Samuel stared at the paper-crude marks of rivers and paths. He couldn't read, but he understood enough. A map meant planning. Planning meant hope. and hope was dangerous. That night, the whispers spread through the quarters. Not loudly, not in bold words, but in careful murmurs passed from hand to hand, ear to ear. Escape, woods, north, freedom. Some dismissed it as madness. Old Ruth shook her head, muttering, the woods swallow men whole. Better to die here than starve out there. Others clung to the thought as if it were air itself. Samuel sat apart, torn. The whip had carved obedience into his back for years. Every scar reminded him of the price of disobedience. He remembered the boy who had tried to run years ago. Dragged back with torn feet and broken bones, his body made into an example. But then he remembered Jonah's grave. He remembered little Eliza, her ribs showing through her skin, coughing herself weak. He remembered Miriam's eyes, fierce and unyielding. And he remembered his mother's voice, long ago, whispering to him in the dark, "You were not born for chains, Samuel. No man is. The soil could only drink so much blood." One evening, when the overseers grew drunk and careless in the big house, Miriam gathered a small circle in the shadows. Samuel, Patrick, and 3 others leaned close. "There's a way north," Miriam whispered. "Through the marsh, then the river. Hard miles, but it's freedom if we make it." Patrick nodded eagerly. "I heard of a place people who help runaways. They call it a line, a chain of safe houses." His Irish lilt made the words sound strange but hopeful. "They hide you, feed you, guide you north, or turn you in for coin," Samuel said bitterly. He didn't mean to crush the hope, but fear pressed on him like iron. Miriam met his gaze, steady and fierce. "Samuel, if we stay, we die slow. If we run, maybe we die fast. But maybe, just maybe, we live." The silence that followed was heavy, but something new stirred in it. Not despair, not surrender. Possibility. Over the next days, the whispers continued. Plans sharpened. Tools were hidden under floorboards. Food scraps were saved in cloth bundles. Each step was a gamble, a risk of discovery, a crime punishable by the whip or the noose. Samuel worked the fields as if nothing had changed. But inside, his chest thundered with a new rhythm. Fear still gnawed at him, but alongside it grew a fragile ember, a dangerous, glowing ember. Hope. One night, as he lay on the dirt floor, staring at the flicker of firelight, Samuel heard Colin's boots outside. The overseer paused by the door, listening. Samuel froze, every muscle clenched, his breath shallow. At last, the boots moved on, but the reminder was clear. One wrong word, one slip, and the dream would be crushed before it began. Samuel turned to Miriam in the dark. Her hand found his, rough skin against rough skin. She whispered only one word, "Soon." And for the first time in years, Samuel let himself believe. Samuel let himself believe. The night was moonless, the air heavy with damp earth and the hum of crickets. In the quarters, the slaves pretended to sleep. Their bodies curled on the dirt floors, but their eyes glimmered with nervous light. Tonight was the night. Samuel's heart hammered as Miriam pressed a small cloth bundle into his hands. Scraps of cornbread, a strip of dried meat. "It's not much," she whispered, "but it's enough to keep us moving." Patrick carried the map in his pocket, his pale face pale even in the dark. His eyes darted, but his resolve held. "We'll make it to the river," he murmured. "If we can cross, the marsh'll cover our tracks." Every step was perilous. Every breath risked discovery. They slipped from the quarters, barefoot on cold soil, moving like shadows across the fields. The cotton rows stretched out like pale ghosts in the darkness. Beyond them lay the tree line, and beyond the trees, a chance. But fate rarely grants freedom so easily. Colin's voice split the night. "Stop right there." Torches flared. The dogs barked, snarling as they pulled at their leashes. Armed men spilled from the shadows the overseers had been watching. Betrayal hung in the air. Perhaps someone had whispered, or perhaps Collins had sensed it all along. Miriam gasped, clutching Samuel's arm. Patrick froze, terror plastered across his face. Colin stepped forward, his scar glistening in the firelight. His grin was wide, cruel. "Thought you could crawl off my land? Thought you'd cheat me of what's mine?" The crack of his whip snapped through the night, but no one moved. The circle of torches tightened. Samuel's chest tightened. He felt the weight of every scar, every lash, every grave dug into the earth. The chains on his wrists were not iron now, but fear. Fear drilled into him since childhood. But in the pit of his stomach, another force surged. Jonah's voice. Miriam's spire. His mother's whisper, "No man is born for chains." Before Colin struck again, Samuel stepped forward. His voice shook but carried strength he had never known. "We are not yours." The words hung in the air, possible, dangerous. The torches crackled. Collins froze, his whip held high, and then everything shattered at once. Miriam lunged, shoving Samuel aside as the dogs surged. Patrick swung a branch he had hidden, striking one of the guards. The night erupted into chaos, shouts, snarls, the snap of whips. The crack of rifles. Samuel grabbed Miriam's hand and ran. Feet pounding, breath burning, they tore through the fields, past the cotton, into the trees. Branches slashed their arms, roots clawed at their ankles, but still they ran. Behind them, torches bobbed like angry stars, the dogs baying closer. Patrick's screams split the dark, cut short by a gunshot. Samuel didn't dare look back. Miriam's grip tightened, her breath ragged. "Don't stop," she gasped. "Don't." The river glistened ahead, wide and black beneath the stars. Salvation or grave? There was no time to choose. They plunged into the water. The cold bit into Samuel's chest, stealing his breath. The current dragged them, pulling, twisting, but it was freedom's current, not chains. Bullets sliced the air, splashing into the river, but the night was on their side. The darkness covered them as the shouts grew fainter. At last, Samuel's feet found mud. He dragged Miriam onto the far bank, collapsing in the reeds. Their bodies shook, lungs heaving, hearts thundering. Behind them, the plantation still burned in their minds. Whips, graves, chains. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Miriam turned her face toward him. Her eyes were wet, but fierce. "We're not free yet." "But Samuel." "We're not slaves tonight," Samuel looked at the stars above the treetops. For the first time, they did not seem like distant, unreachable fires. They seemed like guides. He thought of Jonah, of Patrick, of all the lives swallowed by the soil. Their blood was in the ground, but their spirits carried him forward. And though the path ahead promised hunger, danger, and endless miles, Samuel rose to his feet. His body was still scarred, his soul still bruised. But something had changed. The chains no longer held. With Miriam beside him, and the night stretching wide before them, Samuel took his first true step into freedom.